Good evening and welcome to Evening Exchange. I'm Kojo Nnamdi. The people, places, and experiences one finds in a book can touch you like no other medium can. From the pages of a book, for instance, you can use your imagination to really see how green the color of her dress was. From the pages of a book, you can set the tempo of the music heard by the crowd at that jazz club. You can travel into the depths of the character's mind with an efficiency not afforded you by television nor film. The author of a good book takes you by the hand and tells you the deepest, darkest secrets of each character, and sometimes tells you your own. Tonight, we welcome two authors who are renowned for the journeys we travel from the pages of their books. Gloria Naylor is the author of Mama Day, Linden Hills, The Women of Brewster Place, and her latest, Bailey's Cafe. Ms. Naylor is the winner of the 1983 American Book Award for First Fiction for The Women of Brewster Place. Welcome, Gloria, to Evening Exchange.
Thank you, Kojo.
John Edgar Wideman has won the PEN/Faulkner Award twice in his career. The New York Times calls him one of America's premier writers of fiction. He also writes nonfiction. Pantheon Books has compiled a collection of his work called The Stories of John Edgar Wideman. Welcome to you, John.
Thank you.
Also joining us is Marilyn Saunders Mobley. Ms. Mobley is the Director of African American Studies and Associate Professor of English at George Mason University. Welcome, Marilyn.
Thank you, Kojo.
John, I said you write both fiction and nonfiction, but most people who critique your work say that you blend the imagination and reality so that they are interchangeable, and often one is indistinguishable from the other. Why is that important to you?
Well, there is an Igbo saying that I first heard from Chinua Achebe, and it's an intriguing thought. Quote, "All stories are true."
And that indeed is the name of the first story in your new collection.
And that's the name of the first 10 as a
Well,
little subsection in the book. I don't know exactly what that means, but it's a fascinating idea. And I think the stories, the first 10 stories in that book, are a meditation on that proposition. Just exactly what does it mean? It means many things. It means some simple things. It means that I can be sitting here with you, talking with you and talking with Gloria and talking with Marilyn, but my head could be someplace else. I could be flashing on some event that's occurring right now or something that occurred 50 years ago that I read about, and still the presence in this room maybe is less important than my presence at that other event. And so what's that say about where we are and what's true and what isn't true? But I think it's something that I am fascinated by rather than I can explain.
And in virtually everything I've read about you, even in your conversations with people, you seem to be virtually obsessed with what they travel through in their imaginations, and that's something we hope to explore during the course of this conversation. Gloria Naylor, when I think of you, I think of characterization, the depth of characters that you create. Was that a conscious and deliberate effort on your part from the time you started writing? Were you always fascinated with first character, it seems, and then story?
That's a very astute observation on your part, Kojo, because it's quite true. The creative process begins for me first with images, and I am visited by faces. Ultimately, they will be faces in a situation, and I see my task in writing a novel is to go out in search of that face and that person. So yeah, the character is first, definitely.
How do you go about the process of developing what is behind the face?
Well, a lot of time has to be spent with that person. If they lived in an era different from my own, and I have written about historical...
As Bailey did, clearly.
As Bailey did, and a novel or so back as well. They lived in the early 1900s. I go back through journals to that time. I will go back through a sort of racial memory, if you will, to that time as well, because I believe that we simultaneously know everything that's gone before and that will come after us. That's just me. I feel the mind has that power, and when you get very quiet, that will filter through you. People have often said, you seem older than you are in your writings. Well, I think I'm an old soul. And we've all had babies come in, we'll say, oh my God, that baby's an old soul. See,
yes, I've heard my parents say that on numerous occasions, and yes, you do seem older than you turn out to be in your writings.
Oh, I thought you were going to say your parents said you were an old soul.
No, they didn't say I was an old soul. They said a lot of things about me, but that was not one of the things they said. Marilyn, what is it that you think of when you think of each of these writers individually, and what is it you think that joins them, so to speak?
Well, I'd like to say what joins them first because it's what I like about both of their writing, and that's their use of language, especially their use of the black vernacular. When I read either of them, I just hear voices of black folk. I hear the way we use language, the nuances, the complexity underneath our language. My students are always talking about how we never say anything head on. We always have some other things that we're saying at the same time. And in both of their writing and the phrases that they use and the way they use African American vernacular in particular is what's so exciting about their writing for me. I thought about an essay that John Weidman wrote not long ago. Was a few years ago. It was in the New York Times Magazine called Black Writers and the Magic of the Word, or Magical Words.
I think Magic of the Word.
The Magic of the Word,
way.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's what was so important about both of their works. When students read them, when I read them, I hear how we use language, how black folk use language, and you hear the power of the word. That's what I like about each of them. In terms of Gloria's work, I also like what you were talking about, the characterization. You feel like you know some of these grandmothers. You feel like you know Sophia Wade, and you feel like you know some of the characters in The Women of Brewster Place, which is, I suppose that's the book I've taught the most, but in the works you just feel like these are characters that you've met. The narrator at the beginning of Bailey's Cafe, the way he's using language, you feel like you're sitting down talking to him. You don't feel like you've got to go find somebody who talks like that. You feel you've heard it already. And in John Weidman's works, part of what you said is what I like as well, that you hear I guess I was thinking about the issues that we're dealing with in our culture and in our communities. You hear fiction and you hear the very issues we're dealing with at the same time. And that's what grabs you. I just asked him, for example, whether people were asking him questions about the connection between the MOVE incident and the incident in Texas. And because of the issues that come up in that book, even though it's fiction.
Well, let's talk about that. You wrote Philadelphia Fire. It was based on the bombing of MOVE headquarters back in 1985, and now we're confronted with the assault on the headquarters of David Koresh in Waco, Texas. And we all know that from the very moment that incident began with the killing of the 4 ATF officers, black folks around the United States were saying, remember MOVE? If that was black people, they would have been long killed. Eventually, as it turned out, these people have all perished anyway. What are your reflections and thinking about that?
Well, first of all, depression.
Completely
because
understandable.
one reason I wrote Philadelphia Fire, and the way it ends is, can't let it happen again. But of course, that's always wishful thinking. That's a mantra that we cite when we're just about ready to do bad again, usually. And of course, the Holocaust Museum is opening up. And I'd put somewhere in between Philadelphia Fire and what's happened in Waco, I would put our intervention in Iraq, because it's the same exact syndrome. You demonize people. You pick out one of them as some sort of representative of Satan, and then you go about your business of destroying them, and mainly because they really represent some threat that is unspoken, that is unarticulated, a threat so deep that our culture can't even talk about it. And that's the threat of difference, the threat that life might have to be changed somewhat to accommodate what these other people are thinking and feeling, whether the others are black people or some religious cult or a whole nation full of people.
I don't know if this has anything to do with what we're talking about, but I got the impression that Saddam Hussein and MOVE were demonized to a much larger extent than David Koresh, and that may be one of the reasons why the lingering controversy over how the event in Waco ended, because there were occasions on which we were being given the impression that David Koresh was in fact a negotiating partner here, that it was possible that they could come out of this. So I think the suddenness of what happened has taken a number of people by surprise, but nevertheless, obviously the comparison holds up, and I'm interested in your thoughts.
Well, I've been giving it quite a bit of thought lately. I think it's no secret that indeed white life means more than black life in this country, right? But then how does that play out? There are different factors. When MOVE was destroyed, Wilson Goode was the mayor of Philadelphia, and very much in the center of that action. We now have the Waco cult. Janet Reno is a woman, okay, who had to okay the fiasco that ultimately occurred. I think the hesitation on part might be with having a woman in power. I think the ability to go and destroy people, I think their siege was half a day before they finally firebombed. You can correct me if I'm wrong, John, but they had only held out half a day before they firebombed the MOVE headquarters. Some of that had to do with the pressure I think a black mayor felt with having the world look at him and a city with Philadelphia's peculiar history look at him. It's never easy, black and white.
Do you think Waco had anything to do at all with the pressure a woman felt of being the Attorney General in that situation?
I think that the reticence to go in there and to destroy children had to do with the fact that a woman was at the helm. No, that is part of the reason for the hesitation. But I have heard the talk, if you will, that had they been black, 2 seconds, you know, they would have gone in and just destroyed those people. I am just saying that I don't think it's quite that simple when the decisions are made and it's who's making them. And we have to remember Wilson Good's part in what happened to those people in Philadelphia.
Any thoughts on this at all, Marilyn? Everybody has some thoughts on this.
Well, I've been hearing the same thing, and I believe it's just very complicated. I think it's very complicated, and it's when people are angry, the comparisons come really easy and very simplistic. But I would have appreciated more hesitation in both incidents. You know, definitely more in Philadelphia. It seemed like no time at all, but also more in the other case.
You don't think 53 days was a lot of hesitation and 4 federal marshals killed?
Well, I think there was a lot of hesitation, but I'm saying at the point that they were ready to make a different action, apparently there was less time taken for that particular, you know, in other words, the particular way they started to put the gas in and all of that. It didn't seem like there was a long deliberation about that. Maybe they were deliberating.
Bungled. Once they were given the go-ahead,
well,
that's what I'm saying. Once the go-ahead, I'm talking about once the go-ahead. I agree that it was longer. Yes.
Well, I know all of you tuned in to listen to us talk about writing, and believe me, we're going to bring it back to writing. Is this the kind of incident, given what you have written about Philadelphia fire, given what we're seeing going on now in Bosnia with the so-called ethnic cleansing, is this the kind of incident that makes you want to write more, or do you find it so depressing that you just want to get some distance from it for a while before you deal with it?
What I wish is I had a subject that I could write about and make people laugh. I think that's a real good gift.
Yeah.
That's a great gift. That's a soothing gift. Not just silly laugh, not slapstick, but some of that too. But I would love to be able to write a comic novel, a great comic novel. But unfortunately, there are a lot of things that I don't find very funny right now. And so the energy is directed in that towards trying to keep up with what's happening and trying to connect what is happening at this moment with what's happened in our history. And that's a twofold job, because our history has disappeared. We have to reinvent it, recreate it. And then somebody's in the business of recreating it in a negative fashion, so we have to always fight flash fires. And then we have to compete with the media overall in creating the present. So it's a big job. And
let me know in the comments, what's your favorite comic novel?
it's an important job. And again, it comes down to something about who tells the stories and who owns them, and which stories are true, and how we try to make ours true. But just one little point about
Sure.
the Koresh business and the media and intervention. I think because Koresh was alive and being negotiated with, he couldn't be badmouthed too much. It was
Okay.
like playing a fish on the end of a line. So that prevented the absolute demonization. But on the other hand, if you look closely at reports, there are plenty of indications that that whole scenario was sitting there ready to be pulled in at any time, and the seeds had been of that
Planted.
story had been planted. And so there were preparations for different kinds of outcomes. But the literary point here and the language point is, I read today the beginning of the autopsy. Both the literal autopsy and the rethinking of what went on in Waco. And one could have taken the language, the words, the phrases from the 1985 MOVE incident and used them today, or vice versa. Leading edge being that people burned themselves. The MOVE people were accused of setting fires to burn themselves. One official said the buck stops here. But after that person says it, then there's all sort of scurrying around at lower levels of authority that are going to qualify that statement. So it won't really ever stop there. But I'm talking about exact sentences and exact words.
Replicated
repeated,
from the MOVE incident.
The same way all the commission reports after riots are interchangeable.
But John, since we do live in a country where it makes a difference, as the song goes, if you're black or white, to pervert the song, it makes a difference if you are black or white. Now, what difference do you see within the two incidents, because there has to be one, and race, I think, does play a part. Do you see a difference in how they were treated because one was a white radical group and one was a black radical group?
Well, 50-some days, one part of the difference.
The waiting then.
Yeah, well, friends said to me, have you ever seen the police, they didn't say police, have you ever seen the cops or whatever go after a group of black people and be underarmed? have too little firepower? And I thought, well, no, I don't think I ever remember that happening. And that's for openers. I mean, that's clear. Never have they been underarmed when they or have too little firepower when they went after us. That's just one obvious point.
John talks about the kind of reality that makes it difficult for him to write the kinds of funny or comic stories that he'd like to write at this point. Bailey makes me laugh. But do you find that because of the circumstances we think we reflect last year on the turbulence in Los Angeles and the like, how does that affect your ability to create characters who make us laugh?
Well, I am old enough, and I think everyone at this table is old enough to remember when Los Angeles burnt before.
You are?
So
Don't
yes,
look like
yes.
it.
Well, thank you, Kojo. Isn't that precious? Yes,
Works,
dear, and
don't it?
I wasn't in diapers when it burnt before. And I look at the whole picture. It is extremely depressing to me, the inhumanity that men can perpetuate against men. But you have to be humorous a bit about life if you're going to get through it. I think my background has something to do with that. It's a working class background, well, we aspire to be working class, like I'm used to say. From when you watch how poor people get through life, there is a great deal of humor that will go on with the most dire circumstances, with the rent not being able to be paid, or with the kid needing shoes. You laugh because that helps you to stay human. And then you go about hustling to find a way to have it happen. And I think that's why the stereotype may have arisen that black people are happy people, but that we're not intrinsically any happier than any other race of people. But yes, we find a way to get through something with laughter.
Marilyn, to what extent do your students, those who are aspiring writers and many who are obviously writing already, to what extent do incidents such as Waco, the violence in Los Angeles last year, or any of the things we've been talking about, how does that affect them? Are those things that they tend to want to write about a lot?
Well, they definitely want to talk about them, and sometimes they want to write about them. I mean, it depends on what's going on. One of the things I have my students do is keep a reader response journal. And what I find in the reader response journal is that in the process of responding to the fiction that we're reading, they seep in their responses to what's happening around them. And so I always get both in. I get the response to the literature, and I get how it's connected to what's happening in real life. And so, of course, last year, in a course I was teaching on the 60s, the verdict came out the last day of class. It was almost like I planned it. For all those doubting people in the class who thought the 60s was just something that I like to talk about, they had evidence of how racial hatred and racial violence operate in this culture, and it was very contemporary for them at that moment. And there was also that sort of thing. The language of the past and the language of the present moment started to reverberate for them. But the one thing I was going to say is, I think in these two writers we have some of the responses that I also try to teach, and that is that it's very important for us to look at our current moment and see how it's connected to our racial history. But it's also important for us to look at how, what I call, the cultural unconscious works. And the cultural unconscious for me is how cultural memory works, how racial memory, as Gloria alluded to, works. We have collective memories that talk about how we survived some things, and we've survived a great deal and lived to talk about and lived to laugh about it. So at the same time, we have to be very connected with our pain. We have to be connected with how we have some strategies for survival that we use.
And I would recommend to students that if they are indeed enraged about something or have a passion with something, that perhaps they attempt to first channel that through the essay form, if they will, because your fiction can very quickly become didactic if you don't allow it to ferment and to strive after language and form and just the simple creation and elucidating of moments for themselves and their beauty, and having the belief that that will ultimately, 2,000 years from now, tell a whole truth. But I don't think that fiction or a novel would be the place for passion about a political cause an essay can be, your passions will inevitably come out. They have to, because they only come through you. But I would think it would need
Well,
some
we'll find out
communication.
whether John Edgar Wideman thinks that that is necessary because of the stage of writing that students are at, or if that kind of advice is applicable to writers whenever. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're talking with renowned writers Gloria Naylor and John Edgar Wideman. We are joined by Marilyn Sanders Mobley, who is an associate professor of English and head of the African American Studies Department at George Mason University. When we broke, Gloria Naylor was sounding off about what she felt, how she felt the issue of Waco and riots or rebellions need to be addressed in the form of essays rather than in the form of fiction, and I wanted to throw the same question to John Edgar Wideman.
Well, if there's anything I've learned in about 30, 35 years of pretty intense writing, it's that the process of creation is quite mysterious, and one never knows whether one consults one's own work and history or looks at the masterworks that we would all acknowledge and ask how they were created, under what conditions. You just don't know. It wouldn't be art if there were a program or some way to produce it mechanically. So I always urge my students, and I'm pretty sure this is true, that they're not going to write their best until they find a subject matter about which they intensely care, until they find a subject matter which they have a stake in. Now, I think what Gloria is addressing is very crucial, and that's the question of resonance. If somebody slaps me in the face, I may be able to write down that, boy, I was mad and that I felt a red streak across the side of my face, but maybe I don't see much further than that. I don't notice the way their eyes were looking at me. I don't notice the way their feet were planted. I don't notice the fly on the wall over there. I just know I'm mad and I might want to strike back, and it's very intense, and so I write down in my journal, some gun hit me. I want to off the so-and-so. Now maybe I need a scene in my novel in which I want to show someone hitting another person and what that reaction would be. Well, I might draw from that actual incident. But the fact that I've observed many beatings, both blows that I've been hit or blows I've struck, or reading about torture, or et cetera, then when I bring to bear all that information, there's a chance that I'm going to get that multi-dimensional quality that is resonance that probably makes great work.
After many, many drafts. Now he will go back and elect between 6 words, 1 word that would fit somewhere. He'll elect the lengths of sentences to set up a certain rhythm to get the effect for the reader that you're trying to create. It is artifact of an emotion. Yeah, so I concur
How
with
do
that.
how do you get to that point from where you started, which was with a basic desire to write? How did it all get started for you?
How did I start writing?
Yes.
Well, I've been writing all of my life, so
figured
yeah,
you
I
did.
have been. Yeah, I don't. I can remember when I consciously began to connect the things I cared about and the written word. I was about 12 and a half years old, and my mother gave me a diary. I spoke about that earlier today, because I was a very introverted child, and I didn't talk much in those years. And I began
writing
to
sure
express.
changed you, boy.
It did. It did, Coach. I know she never shuts up. Damn that diary. Yeah. And I began to do that because I would hurt about things, and I was a bright kid and a sensitive kid, and I brooded a lot. So I began to write down at that point what I cared about, which was why I had my 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old wounds on me, emotional wounds or whatever. So it began from then that I associated using words to make order out of disorder. And in a sense, I think I'm still doing that today, but with larger issues.
How did you come, or how do you continue to try to grasp the technical aspects of writing, that is, to understand the structure and the rhythm that best suits what you're trying to say or to express or communicate?
As a practitioner, by simply doing it over and over and over again. I'm an apprentice to my own efforts in that regard. And also by reading good books and having been a reader all of my life. You have to absorb a certain amount about the language just from that.
You talked about language earlier, Marilyn, and I got the impression that that is one of the things you try to insist on to your students, that the understanding of the language and how to use it effectively is probably the most crucial aspect of what they're trying to do, rather than simply trying to get something down on a piece of paper.
Yeah, but I need to clarify what I was saying earlier. I teach literature and not creative writing, so I'm not teaching students in the same way that Gloria and John are teaching them. So I teach them to value the word, and we often spend class time actually dissecting a passage because I want them to hear everything that's resonating in it. And so I use those kind of exercises of close reading to get them to pay attention to how language is operating, how just a choice of a word changes a whole sentence. And then, of course, I encourage them to write carefully. I mean, then that gets into grading papers, and you don't want me to talk about that today. But
I don't know. If you want to talk about it, you're quite welcome.
I don't want to talk about that. I got a pile to grade at home. But I'm just saying that then the other side for me is the actual grading of their writing. But in the teaching, I'm trying to get them to pay attention to how different writers use language to communicate.
It's been said, John Edgar Wideman, that you have been or are different writers in a manner of speaking. You're a Rhodes Scholar, and during that period of your life when you studied at Oxford, and it is said that during that time you read mostly works by white or European writers, and that you yourself moved from being a kind of Eurocentric writer to an Afrocentric writer. Do you consider that to be true? And if so, what were the influences that caused you to do that?
Well, I was always Betty Wideman and Edgar Wideman's son during all that stuff, all those periods of my life. And I think, like all stories, that one has a little bit of truth in it. And but I think it's too handy. I think it's too easy.
It's too easy.
Because the first thing I can remember writing and really wanting to hold on to was a piece about my grandfather. And it was his voice, his Homewood, that's a Pittsburgh, a black Pittsburgh community voice. And he was high on what he called Dago Red, what everybody else called Dago Red, and he was coming to get my mother in the hospital because he wasn't sure whether he wanted her there or not, and she was pregnant with me. And he's tromping through the hospital, and the nurse is telling him, "You can't come in here," and he said, "My daughter's upstairs, I'm going in here." You know, so that's the thing that stuck with me, and that's the thing I try to get down on paper. And it had little flourishes of Rimbaud and little flourishes of Verlaine and parallels, and everything was in it. The music that I'd heard, the rhythm and blues I danced to, all of it, all that was in there. But as I've grown and become more conscious of subject matter and more conscious of the language, then I have tried to draw on the resources that I didn't get as part of my formal education growing up. And in that during that same period of time, like most of us who went to school who were westernized, I believed the propaganda. I believed that there was a difference between what white people did and what black people did, and one counted a little more than the other. I didn't really believe that, but I could become enough of a chameleon to know where my bread was buttered, and so I could produce their version of things pretty much on demand, whether it was vernacular, whether it was anti-vernacular speech, or
is there a point at which you simply made a conscious decision to stop doing that?
No, I still haven't done. You can't, because you are. It's too deeply imbued. In fact, you are probably always. It's at your peril if you forget that those forces are there, that conditioning is there. And I think any black person in America who pretends that they have totally escaped that kind of conditioning is nuts, and they shouldn't totally escape it. We're not talking about black good and white bad. We're talking about true mix, and anything that's central to the culture already has components and history that's African American. So it's a mix. But I'm talking about the terrible aspects, the propagandizing aspects, the aspects that were consciously designed in terms of words and institutions to destroy us, to make us a subject people. That we have to continue to root out and fight and learn to kill in ourselves.
I know whereof you speak. I spent the first half of my life being educated by the British and the second half living in an African American community in this country, and often fail to distinguish between what is what at any given point in time?
Well, listening to John, it was very poignant because I was thinking how my own familial circumstances helped me to escape, as much as it is indeed possible to escape just that, having values from the outside imposed on you as your own values. And I think because of how my parents started out as sharecroppers, you know, and bitterly, at least from my mother's point of view, conscious of the situation they were put in and conscious of what they were not allowed to receive, things that would have been free to any other citizen, like libraries, because my mother, like myself, was an avid reader, and having no access to the libraries that were there for poor people to do just that. So when we began to come of consciousness, we were told repeatedly, and my father being cursed or blessed, depending on what day you talked to him, with 3 daughters, you know, he wanted sons badly, and he made no bones about that, but he had 3 daughters. Being told repeatedly when my sisters and I were coming up, let no one tell you what you're worth, you know, let no one tell you what you're worth, because what they knew coming out of the cotton fields of Mississippi, they had been told that they were worthless, and they knew the scars that it took to climb beyond that. So I am grateful on one hand for that kind of indoctrination in me. It has turned me into a maverick at times, but yet it has indeed spared me from that, and you can see the brainwashing everywhere. You truly can. And yes, I think it is still a part of us. You will get little messages in your own head because it's in the air, it's in the media, you know, it's everywhere, that you count less. So it is a constant struggle. John is right.
We're not only socialized in the middle of a European-oriented society, we're also socialized along gender lines. And your father, you said, had 3 daughters and wanted a son, and you happen to write about baseball very well, I noticed.
My dad's a big baseball fan.
And of course, John is obsessed with basketball. But you write about baseball very well. Is that why?
Oh yeah, I grew up seeing him. He'd have the one game on television, another game on the radio, and he'd be, you know, looking or listening or whatever at both of them. Yeah, he's a big baseball fan. But when I thought about that period, for somehow baseball seemed to just be so pivotal to what America meant. It was a very innocent time before the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima in this country. And baseball was America in microcosm. And then Bailey had his own spin, though, on the introduction of Jackie Robinson to the White Leagues. But Bailey is an iconoclastic guy. But yeah, that's why I think I chose baseball.
Marilyn, a great deal has been said and written about the increasing prominence of women writers in the post-1980 period, which has a little bit to do with my noticing how well Gloria writes about baseball, because more and more of those women writers are causing us to focus on issues that a lot of male writers have not been focusing on in the past, and it has led to some resentment among some male writers. The name Ishmael Reed springs to mind, of course. But what is your own take on that?
Well, I think when people start that argument, they need to look at it historically, and historically so many women's voices were excluded and left out that I don't really have a lot of patience with it. I look at how much, when I started reading African American literature, I was reading male writers almost all the time. Again, I read someplace in an interview, John Whiteman talked about a process of re-education. So if you're trained in European and white American writers, then you have to start re-educating yourself about your own history and culture. And that process for me began almost solely with black male writers. So that's why the 70s and 80s were such an exciting period. So to me, that argument doesn't stand a lot of weight. But I also talk in my classes about the differences between the way black male writers write and the way black women writers write. And I don't think it's simplistic, it's not absolute, but often I see black male writers talking about forces outside of the community and how they affect the community, home and community. And I see women writers focusing on the pressures outside and inside. So you have women writers focusing more on the domestic space and looking a little bit on what are our resources as a black community in spite of those outside pressures. And as I say, I don't want to make it absolute, because sometimes when I think about James Baldwin, I think of a writer who was always looking outside and inside. But I see black women writers filling a kind of void about this cultural unconscious, cultural memory. How do we remember? How do we draw on our spiritual dimensions of our lives? And how have we survived as a result of those? And so I think the gap that's getting filled in makes it exciting and makes me uninterested in perpetuating that debate. And I don't see how Ishmael Reed can believe it, really.
And I think it is a media-sponsored debate at that.
Amen.
And
Thank you.
In Ishmael's defense, he is. I will just draw him out of the closet. It's a great weekend in Washington, for that metaphor, isn't it? Tell you. He is a dear friend of Ntozake Shange's, has been supportive of this woman over the years.
True.
It is hard to find a more radical feminist voice than Zaki's, exactly. And Ishmael has been there, so, you know, like pushing her on and encouraging her in that regard. We have a public face and we have a private face. And in this man's private world, he has always encouraged young black writers, male and female, you know. But if you read the media, it's different.
Well, John agrees it's a media-driven debate, so we don't even have to ask. No, go ahead. What is your take on this?
Well, it's like a lot of things. There are many dimensions to the problem, or to the question, to the issue. Male writers, female writers. One thing we have to remember, we have to contextualize it. Some major forces in this country have, from the very beginning, driven black men, black women apart. And that continues to this day.
It was conscious, it was intentional.
And we have to blow the whistle on that and have to recognize the many forms it takes. It's a continuing destructive problem. It's a problem about age as well. One thing that African society figured out in an interesting way, not a perfect way, but age sets, and the way the younger people relate to the older people, the way everybody relates to the ancestors. There was a lot of thought, cultural thought given to that, and some pretty interesting solutions that we as a people came up with. But now we're in this country and we find out that the generations have been severed over time. And so when we talk about the dangers that young black men are facing, we have to remember that that has something to do with the splitting of male from female and the splitting of the generations, and so we're dealing with the logical outcome of strategies that we should that are the real problems, and we have to always go back to those.
I think you're right, John, but I would like to put in a little plug here for self-determination. You know, having had a teenager, young black male in my home, there are some things we need to take responsibility for ourselves in our relationships and how we conduct ourselves through a society, the repercussions for our own personal behavior. I have come to believe, and we can fight about this after the break, that you cannot lay on the shoulders of American oppression or racism or our peculiar history all of the reasons for why we behave like we do toward each other as men and women, black men and women.
And we will continue this fight after
let's
aforementioned break that nobody told her to mention, but we're going to take it anyway.
We're going to duke it now.
So we'll be right back. Stay with us.
That's the last
Welcome back to Evening Exchange. We're talking with the well-known writers Gloria Naylor and John Edgar Wideman, along with Marilyn Sanders Mobley from George Mason University. And again, when we broke, John was making the point that the division that exists between black men and black women is deliberate, it was consciously intended, and therefore its consequences are logical. Gloria was about to make the point that despite that, there must be some responsibility taken for how black men and black women presumably behave generally and toward one another in particular.
Exactly, within the confines of their own home, within their own community. What we've watched happen, I think, in this country in general when it comes to young people, is that there is less of a willingness to commit to anything, to commit to a career, definitely to commit to a relationship. And black people are not apart from what makes us American. We are indeed African Americans. And so young black men are not, and I'll get to black women in a minute, but young black men are not as willing to commit when children are created. Now we have a whole hoopla about finding the delinquent dads, right, who are not doing child support. Well, those are young black men too who are not supporting children and that they have created. That is a national problem. I cannot put the fact that a man, like, well, let me just get personal.
Get personal.
Get personal. The fact that my sister's husbands, in plural, are not supporting their children, and it will fall upon the extended family to do that, has nothing to do with the white man.
One of the things that fascinates me about that is that there are social scientists who can explain that social phenomenon, who can say that one of the reasons that black men tend not to take care of their children is because of a variety of social phenomena, but when it becomes personal, it seems that we tend to ignore all of those arguments, or do you ignore them in general, or just in the case of your brothers-in-law?
No, I am what you may call, just probably being a lay psychologist here. You will be hard-pressed to put up a history today against the history of my father, for example, coming out of Robinsonville, doing the kind of jobs they had to do in factories in New York City, slugging it away. I mean, if we want to have an oppression beauty contest, I don't think he'd place second, maybe third in this beauty contest. He hung in there with his family. It was not a perfect marriage. No marriage is, because people aren't about that. But I saw in that whole generation a willingness to work at something, and I don't see that willingness now. But I think what maybe happens with the black community is that general trends compact on us with greater detriment. So therefore, if a man will abscond from his family, it will mean more in the black community because that woman is making less. She will have twice as difficult a time.
Allow me to interrupt, though, because what you also seem to be saying is that we have become so used to victim syndrome that we don't expect a great deal of our young people or our males, and so they don't give a great deal because people, social scientists that I just referred to, keep making excuses for them, and so after a while they ride on, they piggyback on those excuses and simply do nothing. John?
Well, I know teenagers do.
Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm almost hesitant to enter into the discussion because it is so complicated, and you can't resolve it in a few back and forths. Clearly, anybody would admit that the social conditions, the economic conditions of this country have gone far to destroying a certain degree of initiative and sense of possession in regard to family. And the family structure itself as an economic unit is dependent on some sort of network of support. Now, if you are a man and you know, if you were a sharecropper in the 1940s, you started probably 5 or 6 families. I've just been reading about people who did that, and I talked to people in my family. There's serial families. Men try to start 4 or 5 times. Now, and women try to start 4 or 5 times. Now, who's to say those were bad people? Who's to say they were irresponsible? But each year, when it came time to settle with the man, it turns out that year of sharecropping, back-breaking labor, etc., produced a minus. They owed a cracker at the end of the year. And then you look around, the kids don't have any clothes, you can't give your wife anything. Those conditions can tear people up. But they were eternally optimistic. Next spring, they may move, they tried to start up other family units. So that's part of what goes on, and it has parallels to what happens now. The question of individual responsibility and fate and what a human creature is and free will versus what environment. I mean, you can't sort those out. They're all relevant. But in our history, it's not worth losing the fact that there is a tremendously large component of outside pressure, oppression, that has been part of determining who we are. But I say to all that, I had to learn to say it, and anybody who wants to escape it, not that I've escaped, but anybody who even professes to escape it, has to say, forget it. It's all there. It explains certain things. But if I want to become a man, if I want to become a person that I can respect and other people respect, then I have to take the weight. I have to take the weight this morning.
And it's not...
Marilyn?
Well, I don't want to interrupt the writer.
No, go ahead. I was just going to
bust up one of his points. He made me think of something, because it is not selective oppression. It is a blanket oppression, which therefore would negate it altogether. So therefore, if I get up and breathe it, and you get up and breathe it, and your excuse is that I'm not doing anything because I'm a black woman in America and look what they do to black women. But if another black woman gets up and she's doing something, then you turn and you say, you know, the classic, and so what is your excuse then? It is there for everyone, so I think that negates it altogether. It means we all carry the 10-pound pack on our backs. So if a relationship is flailing, if you are not there for your home, do not say it is oppression, because it's oppression and racism for the guy next door who is struggling 2 jobs to support his family. That's all. I mean,
Oh, well, I don't know how to get in this. Maybe it's just about
2
over.
feet first,
It's just
Mary.
about over. But what I wanted to say is that when I teach in my classes about oppression, for me it's always important for my students to know that as African Americans, our history didn't begin in America. And I always let them know that slavery was a rude interruption, and we have to acknowledge that rude interruption because in Africa we had family values, we had ways of being, ways of knowing, ways of remembering that were our own. This rude interruption came and brought us over here. So I don't believe in using that as the great excuse for everything. Slavery happened, but I just think when people start talking about family values, I think it's important to look at what happened to our families. How did our families get separated? How did we have to take on a whole new way of being in a strange land? And then I think it's important to say, okay, that stuff did happen. There are things that we can do in spite of, and that's where responsibility comes in. But it scares me, the either or thinking scares me, and I try to discourage my students from thinking that way. I let them know it's both and. We have been oppressed, we are victims of oppression, but we're not totally victims of oppression. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to sit here to talk about it. So we know we knew how to survive, and so that we need to, of course, maybe heighten that. At this point in our history, we need to focus on how do we survive, how do we make it in spite of. But I don't think we can ever negate that part because it's too real. We're still dealing with how racism acts. It's just more subtle now. And sometimes it's not even subtle.
Marilyn, is Herbert Gutman's book, The Black Family and Slavery and Freedom, is that still a valid text? Or has he already been discredited? Because
I don't know if it's been discredited.
Because he did extensive research from, I think, the mid 1700s to the early 1800s to show that our concept of the slave family was just far off from what the reality was, that many slave families stayed together as units more so than we like to believe, and that often the owners would encourage marriage because it meant that a man who had a family would be less likely to run away. And so I don't know whether that's still in vogue now in historical circles, because I don't go in those circles.
I don't go in those circles either, and
I'm
a literature professor.
Okay,
and because I teach literature, I teach slave narratives.
Okay.
So I'm teaching the account that black men and black women give of their lives in slavery. What the sociologists and the psychiatrists and the historians say, I don't always know, but I'm looking at first accounts, first person narratives by the slaves themselves. And in those accounts, they all, from Frederick Douglass to Harriet Jacobs, they all talk about the various forms of separation that they endured. So,
but there's a simple thing here. I mean, not simple, but in the historical argument, the argument was from contemporary period. Somebody like Moynihan saying the black family's breaking down in the 60s, and then there was a jump to the slave period, as if the time in between didn't exist. And so Gutman proved more or less that there was tremendous stability and among some slave families, and that's a new point, and it's still to some extent valid, but it leaves what he didn't fill in was a time post-slavery to the 1920s, the Great Migration. And that new era, I mean, that period is being re-examined, because unless you know what happened then, it doesn't really tell you, it doesn't connect with the slave experience. And what people are finding out in something like The Promised Land by Lehman, Nicholas Lehman, is that there was another devastating period in our history, which was not, in some ways, not as bad as slavery, but maybe even worse. The breakdown of the cotton economy of the South, the dispersion of families and the movement to the north and the getting hit in the head by the urban experience. And that was as destructive to family as the African experience.
And in one of those brilliant segues for which Evening Exchange is highly acclaimed, the names of the books are The Stories of John Edgar Wideman and Bailey's Cafe by Gloria Naylor. We have been very happy to have you both here as our guests today, joined by Marilyn Sanders Mobley, and they'll be back with us, but we do have to take another short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Our thanks once again to Gloria Naylor for joining us. Thank you for being so coy and quiet. Thank you. Thank you, John Edgar Wideman, for joining us.
Thank you, Kojo.
And Marilyn Sanders Mobley, you had a quick word of advice to students.
Well, just to always keep in mind the diversity within our community and to celebrate all the diversity of our perspectives and ways of being and knowing and remembering.
Thank you all for joining us, and of course, thanks to you for watching Evening Exchange. Until tomorrow, good night.
Who would you like for me to do a video on next? What are your thoughts about this video? Please share them in the comments. Please be honest when answering these questions. Share this video with anyone you deem necessary. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.